Hey guys! So, today we are going to talk about configurations. So let's get into it. What do I mean by configurations? And good God, this sounds sexy, doesn't it? Configurations. That's the most interesting part about software, right? Well, maybe not. But I still want to talk a little bit about it because I have some thoughts on this and I just want to share them with you. This is basically just me giving you a personal preference to the different approaches to configurations and some thoughts I have on the different ways you can provide, in my personal opinion, two different types of configurations and the approach and a few of the pros and the cons from my perspective with these approaches basically. So let's start with the first configuration. Let's talk about build time configurations and that sort of thing. What do I mean by build time configuration? Well, I mean basically that you have a configuration file of some sort that does something that is non-critical, or rather that is not required necessarily at runtime. It's something that is not going to, it's something outside of the application's knowledge. Say that if you're working in a project that requires compilation of assets, or that you build a dist folder or something like that. You have a make file maybe, or a Maven job, or npm script, something like that, right? So, the different ways of approaching this, I've tried, like, you have configuration files with like a JSON file maybe, or an XML file if you're using Maven, for example, or Ant files, Ant's XML files. There's different ways to doing this. And on the whole, I have to say that my two favorite approaches to solving this, I've found in two different types of setups. And let me just explain why. Like, you have this idea of configuration versus convention, or convention versus configuration, or configuration as code. Those are in general the three ways that people kind of structure their configurations. And I will have to tell you that the convention over configuration is, in my personal opinion, my least favorite one. Now, hear me out. It's not because it's necessarily a bad idea, because sometimes I actually think that convention over configuration is a good thing. It's a very good thing if everybody knows, like for example, if you already know the ecosystem, like take Ruby for example, or Elixir, or rather the Phoenix framework for Elixir. Like, these are the sort of projects where you have this practices or conventions over configuration, where if you know how it's supposed to look and work, you don't have to have all these configurations. The problem with this, in my personal opinion, is that it introduces something that I hate above all else. It's the same thing that Java does, and I hate, or rather old style Java, and I hate it. I absolutely hate it. I hate that I cannot infer what is supposed to happen by just reading the project. I have to have what I call higher level knowledge, or knowledge that is outside of what I'm looking at in order to understand what's going on. In other words, if I don't know exactly where to put my web XML file, for example, my project won't work. And I don't know that. So if I know the ecosystem really well, convention over configuration is a great thing because it saves me a lot of hassle. But you have to already know a lot of stuff in order to make that work. That's my personal opinion. And then you have things such as, after that it's just a plain old configuration file, and that can also get a little bit messy, where you have like a flat file, like say a YAML file or something like that. But honestly, I kind of prefer that, because what's beautiful about just having a simple file, that's just a static file, of a JSON file or a YAML file or something like that, is that although it might be like hieroglyphics to somebody, it's very easy for you to read through and have that as a reference and compare it to something else. So if you have two configuration files and you're trying to figure out why one configuration is working and another configuration isn't working necessarily, you can compare them very easily. to me it's very easy to follow that stuff. But I would say that having a configuration file at runtime is a little bit of a no-no. I'll explain why, at least my personal opinion, in just a moment. But first and foremost, we are going to finish by the first part of this by stating that, say that you have configuration as code, which is a very common approach in, say, Spring Boot uses this approach, and Webpack does this as well. Now, this is hands down my favorite way of managing configurations, because it gives me as a developer, in, say, Webpack. A Webpack it's very complicated. I think that they have a lot of things to improve in order to make the configurations nice. But what I do like about it is that it is code. And that is a very powerful thing, because it's code, that I have a lot of freedom to do whatever I want with the configuration, and I can actually add logic to my configuration. But that doesn't mean I should. Oh, good God, it shouldn't be there. If you are making your configurations like if you're creating a program inside of your Webpack file, your config file, you're doing something wrong. You're doing something really wrong. I've worked in projects where, like, I'm actually doing that right now, where like we have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 different files for just our configuration setup. It's such a mess, guys. Like, configuration as code is a powerful thing, but you should not mistake that power for something that you should mess around with. You should keep it dirt simple. That's what I tell people about Sass and CSS and so forth. Don't use for loops in your Sass. Don't add a bunch of logic. Just keep it simple. You don't have to complicate it just because you can. It's easier to have it simple, or it's better to have it simple. My favorite, like, take Spring Boot, for example, where you have an actual typed language. That is really powerful. If the designers of the framework or the creators of the framework have added types for the different configurations, you can actually get a lot of help when you have your configuration as code. It's the same thing with Webpack. If you have an incorrect configuration setup, you can actually try to run your file, and the CLI will actually tell you that, oh, you have an incorrect named property here. That's the power of having a configuration as code type of approach. You can get all these subtle little benefits. So I really like that. When I make my own small little open source project, I follow Webpack's, these have been in JavaScript, so I follow the Webpack style of doing things, because just giving somebody a JSON file, or say a JavaScript file, it's actually, I think it's very elegant. Just from my experience, there's a lot of benefits to it. However, when it comes to runtime configurations, there are 2 different approaches that I see people using. They use an environment file, or they use environmental variables. My personal opinion on this is that you use environmental variables. Always use environmental variables. So because the reason why I argue that this is the way to go is because there are several reasons. To me, the worst thing is when you have like this environmental file and you have to update that. Whenever you create a new project for somebody, you have to put all your configuration in that environmental file, and you cannot add any type of sensitive information in your environment file that is supposed to be part of, like, say, your version control. If you didn't know this, for the juniors out there, never ever include your API tokens or anything like that in your version control. Never commit it at all. It doesn't matter if you remove it, because as long as there's a log or a diff in your Git history, people can find your sensitive token or key or whatever. So by having it as an environmental variable that you inject in from your environment, you get the maximum amount of flexibility. You don't have to think about a file system. If you don't have that, you don't have to think about adding sensitive information to your environment file. You don't have to load different files. All you need is an environmental variable, and that's it. And I think it's very nice. I mean, there are downsides to using an environmental variable as well, but overall I think that's the way to go. So if you need to inject, say, database information or anything like that at runtime, or maybe you have if else condition where if it's in production or if in development, for example, put that in an environmental variable so that you can just add it to your environment whenever you're running the project. So it's a very subjective opinion, of course, but I prefer that approach over using a environmental file. And I don't know, there's no right or wrong here. This is just my personal preference. So hopefully this was useful to you. Have a great day.